Hi, I'm Jonathan Larsen with TYTI Daily, managing editor of TYT Investigates, and we're talking today about a story we broke last week involving Morgan Stanley, one of the biggest Wall Street firms in the country, and Akin Gump, one of the most powerful lobbying firms, also a law firm in the country. And the story essentially was that a conference call that we obtained audio of revealed people from both companies talking about the price of oil and its connection to reopening the economy. The call took place on April 22nd, and one of the exchanges, which formed the core of our story, is something I want to read to you right now. The first person talking was Lamar Smith, former Republican congressman from Texas. He's now a lobbyist for Akin Gump. Talking about the price of oil, he wrote, "The problem we have, the crisis, isn't just one of overproduction, it's one of underdemand, and we're never really going to solve the crisis, any form of the crisis, I don't think, until we both reduce the impact it's going to have on healthcare and the economy both. We have to increase the demand, and that means get the economy back on its feet, and we have to look out for the energy industry, which is so essential to our national security and so essential to our economic well-being." Devin McDermott, an analyst from Morgan Stanley, responded, "That's very helpful. We definitely agree with your last point there. The underlying issue here with what's going on in oil markets is really a demand issue. And the demand's not there to consume the fuel that we're producing. And to really fix that sustainably, we need to begin to reopen the economy and increase consumption." And for the story, I spoke with University of Maryland Carey School of Law professor Michael Greenberger, also the founder and director of the university's Center for Health and Homeland Security, as well as a former head of trading and markets at the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. And Professor Greenberger, I hope it's all right if I call you Michael, because we've spoken many
Please do.
before. Okay, thanks so much for joining us here and for helping me out with the story.
Happy to do it.
So one thing I want to get at is kind of, it sounds like a little semantic thing, but you said something to me when we spoke about the story that kind of crystallized this for me. Devin McDermott responds to Smith saying, "We definitely agree with your last point there." Is it clear who "we" is?
Well, I can tell you that it certainly includes Morgan Stanley and Morgan Stanley's substantial oil interests. If there is a quote client involved in all this, it is Morgan Stanley. People may think an investment bank, what does an investment bank have to do with oil? But all the big banks have substantial oil interests. They're buried within the financial statements because they're subsidiaries of subsidiaries of subsidiaries, but they're located all over the world. And in the good times, let me say in July of 2008, this is hard to believe today, oil was at $147 a barrel. And the big banks were feasting off the revenues of that exorbitant price just as much as the American consumer was being damaged substantially by it. So in today's market, where we're facing sort of the obverse, which is potentially very low price of oil, and as you and I have spoken about, it went to the US benchmark went to minus $37 not too long ago. The worry here that's expressed is the worry not for the public at large, not for clients that produce oil, but for Morgan Stanley's oil interests.
The prospect of reopening, though, at a time when we don't have the many public health measures that the experts have said are necessary for us to reopen safely. They're the reason to shut down, right, is to implement these widespread, if not universal, public health measures and give them time to take effect. We haven't done any of these, though. Is it possible, when we spoke, you referred to the right hand and the left hand of Morgan Stanley maybe disagreeing on this issue. Is it possible that there are factions at Morgan Stanley that would not be happy about this?
Well, there may be other financial interests that Morgan Stanley has that are not happy about it. It may also be true that personnel at Morgan Stanley and their families, their parents and their grandchildren, would be very worried about this. as you mentioned, I am not just dealing with oil pricing as an expertise, but I also run an internal university consulting service, and I have over 25 professionals on staff giving advice to over 90 clients on the health problems that COVID presents. And one of the problems we have with opening or not opening is a battle between whether policy making decision only worries about going back and restoring the economy or tries to balance the two. And a balance is a slow opening measured even by President Trump's CDC guidelines, which, by the way, he's not following. But other states are, like, for example, Maryland will not open until they have clear signs that COVID is under control. What the Morgan Stanley statement says is public health be damned. We need to open the economy and do more drilling without a real concern for public health. When I said the right hand may not do know what the left hand is doing, Morgan Stanley obviously has interests in hospitals, health concerns. Private equity is all over, for example, nursing homes. And that side might want a gradual opening, if not also for personal well-being of Morgan Stanley's workers. But the right side, dealing with oil, wants this open fast because they're losing money hand over fist.
Well, the CEO actually, James Gorman, I think it is, he actually had coronavirus. He was reported last month to be in full recovery, but he himself had it. But I guess one of the things I wrestle with is that long term, if you open up poorly, is there any sector of the economy that doesn't suffer from a poor, rushed rollout, reopening?
Jonathan, you are 100% right. And what you are seeing from governors like Cuomo and our governor in Maryland, Hogan, who's a Republican, by the way,
yeah,
is an argument that if you open quickly, you may defy all policy hopes. That is to say, and we're going to see this in the coming days, the places that open will have spikes in coronavirus infections and deaths. This is not some policy that you have to wait months to see how it's working. You will, in a day, and we will see this coming week, where, for example, in Texas or Georgia or other states where there's widespread opening, corona infections and corona deaths will follow suit. So you may say, oh, I want to help the economy and open everything I can, healthcare be damned, but it will soon be very clear to the American public that arbitrary openings inconsistent with public health concerns will damage both public health and the economy.
So if that's the case, these are the big brains, right? This is Wall Street. Is it just that our systems have become so incentivized to chase the short-term buck that no one even thinks long-term anymore, or what's going on here?
Unfortunately, your worry about not taking every factor into account besides profit is at work here. The metric that probably comes most to the attention of an investment bank like Morgan Stanley is how are they doing on their financials. They're seeing losses, massive losses in the oil industry. The price of oil has already reduced itself so much that the shale oil interests in this sector are going to be completely unable to exist. You have to have a $45 price of oil to do shale oil fracking, things of that sort. So when you ask the question, and I've seen this going all the way back to before the 2008 financial crisis, the thing that is foremost on the financial sector is how much money is coming in the bank today, not looking at the broader concerns about public policy. And the unfortunate thing is that the financial sector has so much lobbying power that they blind even the most open-minded members of Congress to doing this kind of balancing. What we have going for us now is that these openings will directly affect day-to-day statistics on infections and deaths. And what we will see is in those parts of the country opening too quickly, infections and deaths will rise. And what does that mean? I mean, you will see the opponents to these openings are people in hospitals that are caring for COVID patients. They are overrun, and they know that opening in advance of the proper data is going to damage the ability of the healthcare sector to provide health responses to COVID. I would just finally say, you mentioned the head, I believe the head of Morgan Stanley as having recovered. We see from Donald Trump can get tested. He's now going to be tested every day. He has valets serving him his Diet Coke.
Yeah.
The wealthy are not impacted by COVID as much as the average American citizen, and certainly we see the heavy impact this has had on minority communities. They can't be tested. They can't have valets presenting them their meals, and they may not have ventilators or other personal protective equipment available to them or their healthcare workers that the head of Morgan Stanley has.
We've seen these anecdotal horror stories about people of color, Black people, Black women, showing up at hospitals or medical facilities, presenting with symptoms and being denied tests once, twice, and then dying from it.
Yes. And by the way, the testing, I could go on at great length about that. We are like a third world country when it comes to testing. We are per person in the population doing the worst testing probably in the first world and maybe even the third world. Trump keeps pointing to the absolute number of tests, which are roughly 5 or 6 million. But when you look at tests per members of the population, the testing is not there, even in minimal terms. Roughly, we're testing 5,000 people a day. We should be testing hundreds of thousands of people a day.
You mentioned the lobbying power of big oil, and another story we reported in connection with this tape and this internal Morgan Stanley report was the notion that enough Democrats might compromise by giving, if the Republicans agreed to give parity with tax credits and other benefits for the renewables industry. And I guess you and I talked about this, so I know I have an idea of what you're about to say, but what would you say to Democrats who are looking at that deal and saying, you know what, that's a worthwhile trade-off if I can help out renewables and save the fossil fuel industry?
Well, generally, one of the great problems progressives have had, and I'm talking about progressives dealing with financial market issues, is too often, too many Democrats are captured by the lobbying in the financial sector. And by the way, when we talk about the oil industry, frankly, I worry less about ExxonMobil than I worry about JP Morgan Chase. The hard oil industry, in my experience, is more reasonable about these policy decisions than the big banks are. And we must understand the big banks are directly affected by the price of energy. You may hear that they're worried about global warming and they have policies for it. But as you suggested, the key policy determinant for the big banks is the bottom financial line. And to Democrats looking for political contributions who are mostly untutored about the role big banks play, they are too often ready to make policy decisions that are formed by lobbying by the big bank interests. Now, I will say this, those of us who want to end the COVID experience as fast as possible are helped by what I believe will be the very quick statistical response showing that where openings happened without serious concern, infections go up, deaths go up. And I will say that I think the Democratic Party as a whole is much more sympathetic to those statistics. And my worry that good Democrats will be dazzled by large political contributions, I think will be met by the worry of the fact that the United States infection numbers and death numbers are completely off the charts as compared to the rest of the world.
You also talked, though, about the idea that Democrats who think they're helping renewables by giving the tax credits, that's not actually helping them.
Well, the point I would make there is the renewable at issue in oil prices is fracking, is shale oil. It's not the conventional way you produce oil. And there is a widespread concern. Shale oil needs a $45 per barrel rather, price of oil. You know, we're now, oil has come up to West Texas Intermediate, which is the US benchmark, is 25, which by the way, it was at minus 37. So 25 is good. But my worry is that too many people, when they hear that the shale oil industry will diminish, co-equate that with the strength of the American economy. In other words, if a stock goes from 50 to 15, we all agree that's not good. But if oil goes from 50 to 15, it is not clear that that is bad. In the 1990s, when the US economy was soaring and President Clinton at the end of 2 years was balancing the year-end budgets for the first time forever. And when President Bush took over, that was the end of that. But we did that. We had a thriving economy in the 90s when oil was in the 20s. It is not a disaster globally or universally for the American public if oil is in the 20s. You don't say, oh, oil was before COVID in the 60s and 50s, and now it's in the 20s. We got to get that oil price back up. You've got to look historically. The American economy in the 1990s was as strong as it's ever been with oil in the 20s. That means businesses, consumers who are driving, they can do that cheaply, and that benefits the economy as a whole. And that factor is not being spoken about anywhere. There is a general worry, Democrats and Republicans, that when oil's in the 20s, that's somehow bad. It's not bad. It's very, very good.
The flip side, though, right? There's kind of a tension here, because isn't the flip side, and again, you and I have talked about this, the flip side is if the price of gasoline at the pump is pretty low, that extends how long people are willing to use it. It encourages people to buy SUVs. It hurts the advance of renewables. And I wonder if you could tell the story that you told me on the phone about the Saudi official talking about the price of gas getting too high.
Well, without getting into an elaborate detail, in 2009 and 2010, I was asked by the Saudis to participate in a study commission of 20 oil-producing countries, 20 oil-consuming countries. At that point, the Saudi king for that matter, was attacking Wall Street for their manipulation of the price of oil that brought it ultimately to $147. And I was in Riyadh. I was in the office of a Saudi prince who was also the deputy energy minister. And we were talking about this, and I said to him, you know, I can't understand why the Saudis, who sell a lot of oil, are against the fact that oil is in the hundreds rather than their model price would be 75 to 85. Why do they care? And the principal answer was because high oil prices drive people away from the use of oil to alternative sources of energy. And whatever the price of oil has been since in the last decade, that has been a rapid growth area. Oil is becoming like coal. It's not a necessary determinant of the way we live our lives. So you pointed out if we have a price of 20 and that means gas prices are lower, there may be more people driving their cars, hurting the environmental climate. But I think there is a movement afoot toward electric cars, self-driving cars, what have you, that is going to go forward, whatever the price of oil is. So I think in the short term, it will be a net benefit financially to our economy and to our interest in fighting global warming to bring the price of oil down to where supply demand dictates that it be, which is right now somewhere in the 20s.
And I forget whether I used this in the story or not, but you told me, talking about the call that Morgan Stanley and Akin Gump had, where with their concern about the level of demand at the moment, and you said to me, the real fear here is not that the demand is being reduced, but that the reliance on oil is being reduced by forcing the public to go to forms of alternative energy. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, no, I think that the investment banks, commercial banks, who are so heavily into the oil industry in many different ways, have the same fear that the Saudi prince had in 2010. When oil was well over 100, it went to 130, 140. If you're dealing in oil, what's wrong with that? It drives people away from the use of oil. And I think what the Morgan Stanley executive was saying is we've got to bring the price to a point that does not drive people away from the use of oil, which would hurt the Morgan Stanley investment coalition.
And there's also a schism, though, right, between the big oil, the traditional drilling operations, which can make a profit, as you said, at $25, $30 a barrel, and the fracking companies, generally smaller operations, I think, if I have that right, that need it to be up 60 or so per barrel. How does that schism play out in terms of the politics here if their interests are to some extent at odds?
Well, you know, we're now dealing with the interest of the Trump administration and many others in Congress of giving subsidies to oil and gas. Never mind people who are losing their jobs because of the COVID experience. And Elizabeth Warren has been very outspoken against these subsidies. And those subsidies are really designed to offset losses that are being experienced from shale oil fracking. Now, by the way, there are a lot of small shale oil industries, but the big oil companies are involved in that as well. They can have the fortune of being able to shift away from shale to whatever is productive. The smaller companies, that's how they're making their money. And having come from a hard coal mining area that was depressed when John F. Kennedy ran for president and has remained so ever since, fracking has given Scranton, Pennsylvania, a boost. So it hurts me to say I want to see fracking stop for that reason. But fracking has a direct correlation to environmental damage. And if fracking is stopped, the cost-benefit analysis is the American consumer will be better off with less fracking. And if there will be less fracking to the extent the price of oil is in the 20s and the 30s. And the worry about subsidization or the worry of Morgan Stanley is that oil not remain in the 20s and 30s, but go back to where it was pre-COVID in the roughly 40s, 50s, and 60s.
So I want to end with two cynical scenarios here. One gets to that the sort of fracking community in Pennsylvania or wherever, to me, it feels like those workers, right? Those workers are, that industry is ultimately doomed anyway. And it seems to me those workers would be helped a lot more if they were transitioned into a renewables field more quickly. And it seems to me that drawing that out does two things. It enables the people who own it to extract money from everyone in the process, but it also means that the workers are now going to be the last people standing when it comes time to transitioning, because everyone else is already transitioning.
You're absolutely right about that. Look, as we are appropriating trillions of dollars in support for the economy, people like Elizabeth Warren are saying or Nancy Pelosi for that matter, are saying not enough attention is going to help the average worker. This is all designed to help Fortune 500, private equity that owns a lot of businesses that are being supported. Speakers Pelosi, Senator Warren are absolutely right that while we are trying to help portions of the economy by appropriating trillions of dollars, more attention needs to be paid to those workers in Scranton, Pennsylvania, who will be laid off because fracking goes away, to them getting public benefits and ideally to be transitioned into jobs that are consistent with a sustainable economy. For example, right now, many Democrats are pushing people to be employed as contact tracers who can trace the extent of the exposure of the COVID infections. That is a work-intensive process. The country needs thousands of those workers now. We ought to be putting people who are unemployed into those jobs, train them for it, put them into it. And that would be an opening example of letting the American public as a whole benefit for the trillions of dollars of subsidies that are being expended.
And that would be an investment that would, of course, pay off within 14 days, if I have the math right.
You're absolutely right. It's a 14-day contact tracing process, and that allows us to know the geography of the infections. And if people know the geography of the infections and who is infected, those people can be isolated. It makes it easier for us to open the economy up. Right now, we're trying to open the economy up running blind.
Well, so now let's get to the last cynical scenario I want to float to you, and then I'll let you go. But this has been giving me flashbacks to the Iraq War, because the cynical interpretation of what we have here with this massive, powerful lobbying firm talking to one of the financial giants of the globe about, on April 22nd, about needing to reopen the economy so that they can jack up the price of oil. That sounds to me very reminiscent of the idea that we had to go to war for oil, that people would literally die for the benefit of the fossil fuel industry. And I hate even thinking that that's true in a ignorant, dumb sense, let alone a Machiavellian, I'm doing it on purpose sense. But in your experience of both industries, fossil fuels, big money, how wrong am I in that? How right am I in that?
That was a very legitimate concern. The Iraqi war, no doubt, was poorly conceived as a policy of protecting our oil supplies. And even Donald Trump talks about his great relationships with the Saudis. And the American oil economy, even without fracking, is in very, very healthy shape. We moved in 2012, 2013, from being a net importer of oil to a net exporter of oil. And it's true, with shale oil's help, we became a little OPEC in the world economy. If we lose shale oil and we increase alternative sources and supplies, we will stay in that status, and we will not be dependent on Saudi Arabia or OPEC or Russia for oil supplies. So the fact that we are eliminating one part of our oil supply network, that is shale oil, will not put the United States into the posture of saying, oh, we've got to go to war to keep our oil supply lines open. We're in good enough shape in 2020 that that is not a realistic problem. And even more important, I think the American public has begun to understand that. So they will not be led into another war trying to protect oil supplies.
Well, I didn't actually mean to suggest that we might go to war. I guess I was just, to me, there's a parallel in terms of the moral calculus being made. Is it a question of, are we seeing people literally being willing to say people are going to die because the oil industry needs people to die, even without a war, just the reopening, I mean.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, the arguments for opening are not, if you peel the onion, you get that. We don't care who dies, we want the economy open. But, and even the president has fallen into that trap. But the general argument is a little more sophisticated, is the people are being unemployed, they're suffering, so let's open the economy so we can bring people back to work. And as we've explained, what will be shown is where the economy is open, more people will get sick, the healthcare system will be overrun, and we will not only have a healthcare problem, but an even worse economic problem.
Professor Michael Greenberger of the University of Maryland Carey School of Law, as well as the founder and director of the school's Center for Health and Homeland Security. Your resume is so long, I have to make sure I'm reading it to get it right. Thanks so much for all your help on this story and with speaking with me today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan.
And everyone else watching out there, thanks very much for watching TYTI Daily. If you don't already, I hope you'll subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're here every day at 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time. And you can also check us out on Facebook. And we'll be back tomorrow. In the meantime, take care of each other. Take care of yourselves. Bye now.